Welcome. My name is Matt Walhout, and I'm Dean for Research and Scholarship here at Calvin College. This is the final event in our Just Citizenship series this semester, and on behalf of the series sponsor, Provost Cheryl Branson, I want to thank you for being here at this special event. It's my privilege today to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Robert Bullard. Dr. Bullard is a sociologist and distinguished professor at the Barbara Jordan Mickey Leland School of Public Affairs at Texas Southern University in Houston. We're also honored that his wife Linda has joined us. She is a distinguished attorney. She's also a novelist, author of Shades of Justice. You can check that out on Amazon. As it happens, Linda is also a Grand Rapids native and was the first black prosecutor to be hired in Grand Rapids, and the also first female prosecutor some time ago. So welcome, Linda. For decades, Robert Bullard has studied the injustices and inequities that have been built into the urban systems and environmental policies in the United States. He was one of the first scholars to bring these issues to national attention, and over the years he has provided intellectual leadership and inspiration to a generation of researchers and activists who now look up to him as, quote, the father of environmental justice. Dr. Bullard has, at last count, written 18 books and earned a number of prestigious awards for his work, including the Sierra Club's John Muir Award and the American Bar Association's Award for Excellence in Environmental, Energy, and Resources Stewardship. In 2014, the Sierra Club even created a new prize in his name, the Robert Bullard Environmental Justice Award. These days, Dr. Bullard is in high demand as a public speaker, and it's a great privilege for us to have him with us here today to talk about climate change and human rights. And what great timing this is, as just this past weekend, on the eve of the People's Climate March in Washington, D.C., the Environmental Protection Agency took down its climate change website. When it comes to the issue of climate change, we often look to natural scientists who tell us the physical facts. We need biologists, chemists, and geologists to gather and interpret reliable data. But if we want to understand how people will be affected by climate change, and if we want to know which communities will suffer most from it, then we should look to the human sciences like geography and sociology. And if we want our leaders and legislators to make wise decisions on these issues, we have to assess our situation in terms of social history, demographics, and political systems. Today, we have the privilege of learning from an expert who understands more than most people do about all of these connections. So I invite you to join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Bullard.
Good afternoon. First, I'd like to thank Calvin College for inviting me to give a lecture on a talk that I'm I love to give this talk. And timing is everything. And I think it's important that we understand that we don't have a lot of time to debate these issues. It's time to act. Climate change and human rights, making the connection through an equity and social justice lens. My job this afternoon is to connect dots, and I'm very good at connecting dots, and I was very good as a kid doing that. And I'm even better at that as an adult and as a sociologist. I am an environmental sociologist, and I'm proud to say that I am an environmentalist. The issue of environmental justice and climate change and human rights, I like to write, and I like to see my name in print. For some reason, I've written 18 books that cover a range of topics and issues dealing with housing, transportation, energy, climate, food security, smart growth, disaster response, a whole bunch of issues. It's 18 books, but it's actually one book, but don't tell anybody. The glue that pulls all those books together can be summarized in 3 areas: fairness, justice, and equity. If we deal with environment, you can put justice behind it, and you get environmental justice. If we deal with transportation, and as a matter of fact, I wrote 2 books on transportation. One is called Just Transportation, Dismantling Race and Class Barriers to Mobility. I wrote another book called Highway Robbery, Transportation, Racism, and New Routes to Equity. The reason why it's important that we understand how to connect the various sciences, and Matt didn't tell you that he was at a march, not this past Saturday, but the Saturday before, a march for science. Science is under attack. The environment is under attack. Facts are under attack. And so it's very important that we really establish this one ground rule that I have set for myself during this lecture is I'm going to give you the facts, but understanding, having the facts has never been enough. We must take those facts, those findings, those data, and move and act on them. And so I am a sociologist, as I said, by training, and I do scientifically what's called, I'm in a church, so I won't kick butt sociology. I tell people I do not do dead white man sociology, I do kick butt sociology. So environmental justice, let me just run you through decades of work. In 1968 was an important year. There was a year that Dr. Martin Luther King went to Memphis, Tennessee on an environmental, economic, human rights issue of striking garbage workers. The workers were on strike, black workers, sanitation workers, garbage workers, for equal pay, for equal work, for better work conditions, and for to be treated like men, like human beings. And so when we talk about justice and we talk about the connection between environment and equity and race, let's understand that 1968 mission that Dr. King was on, and he did not survive Memphis. Of course, he was assassinated in April of 1968. 1978 was another year, 10 years later, for me, a personal experience. 2 years out of graduate school, I graduated from Iowa State University, and my wife and I moved from Grand Rapids in 1976. Actually, East Grand Rapids, I get corrected. I think there's a difference. To Houston, Texas, 4th largest city in the country, only city in the country that does not have zoning. It has what's called unrestrained capitalism. You can build it if you got the money. You can build it anywhere if you have more money. And one day, we both worked for a state university, Texas Southern University in Houston, Texas, same university where I work now. And she worked in the law school, named in honor of Thurgood Marshall Law School. And one day she came, and she had a private practice. She came home one day and said, "Bob, I accepted this case, and I'm suing the state of Texas." Now, I said, "I work for the state of Texas. You are suing my employer." And she said, "Yeah." And she said, "I'm suing the city of Houston and Harris County. This company is trying to locate this sanitary landfill in the middle of this predominantly black middle-class community. Now, when I say predominantly black, that's like me saying my family is predominantly black. It was an all-black community, and how we know Jim Crow created it. This was a sanitary landfill, but we know there is nothing sanitary about a landfill. This is where garbage goes, and garbage, when you think about garbage, you think of probably twice a week, put it in a bag or put it in 2 bins if you recycle, twice a week. And it goes somewhere. It doesn't go to garbage heaven. It goes to a landfill, generally. And so she said, I've sued this company. I won't call any names, but the initials will be fine. The second largest waste disposal company in the world, headquartered in Houston. And she said, I need someone to collect data for this case because, you know, I have to go to court in 2 weeks, or was it 3 weeks? It was a short period of time, and I trying to get this restraining order, and I need somebody to collect data for this. I need somebody to find out where all the landfills are and solid waste sites are in Houston, and put it on a map, and we can go into court. And I said, she said, I need somebody to work with census data. I said, you need a sociologist. She said, that's what you are, right? I said, yeah. That's how I got drafted, kicking and screaming. I was not, trained to do environmental justice. There's no such field. I received a PhD in sociology from Iowa State University. My area was demography. I did residential segregation. I worked with census data. I knew how to take information and put it on a map and plot it, et cetera, in terms of housing discrimination. And so the training that I received at Iowa State was transferable to this particular case. I had 10 students in my research methods class at Texas Southern University. And I told my students, I said, we're going to do this research project. And we're going to do this study. And we did. And we used various methodologies for gathering this data over a period of time. Understand this was before cell phones, iPads, iPods, laptops. We had a mainframe IBM computer, and we ran the data on punch cards. All you old-timers understand what I'm talking about. You youngsters, you have no idea. That's all right. It was like a hammer and a chisel, ancient. We gathered data information from the City of Houston Solid Waste Department. I told my students, tell the city personnel that you are doing a study for Dr. Bullard in our research class, and we are plotting where the solid waste facilities are in Houston, period. We didn't tell them we were doing a lawsuit for this case. It wasn't a business. And so we gathered information from the state. We gathered information from old archival maps. We gathered information from the cities, from the library, and from the archives, the Houston Historical Archives. Information stored on microfiche. That's another old, where old newspapers going back to the 30s in Houston were stored on microfiche. Now everything is stored digital. Microfiche, you go in, get the box, load it up, crank it up, read. Nod your head if you understand what I'm talking about. Long time ago. That's how we did research, long time ago. We did windshield surveys. Once we had addresses, line up, master list, we went out, sent the students out with the list, go out, find the address. If you physically see the facility, you note that it's there. But in many cases, I tell my students, I say, if you see a mountain in Houston, and Houston is flat, below sea level in many cases, if you see a mountain, be suspicious, landfill. I say, in some cases where there is no artifacts there, and you have the address, go and ask the people who live in the neighborhood, and you ask those old people, they will tell you what was in that neighborhood going way back, and they can tell you what was there and when it opened and when it closed. We were able to document that. I said eyeball, that's windshield surveys, and so we were able to triangulate the information that we got from secondary data, from archival, from physically seeing, and from what's called ethnographic, interviewing people and documenting. We were able to document that from the 30s up until 1978, 100% of all the city-owned landfills were located in predominantly black neighborhoods. predominantly black neighborhoods. 6 out of 8 of the city-owned landfills were located in predominantly black neighborhoods, and 3 out of 4 of the privately owned landfills were located in predominantly black neighborhoods. 83% of all the waste dumped in Houston was dumped in predominantly black neighborhoods. Now, this was amazing to me, and as I said before, I had no idea what I was doing, but I was being guided by a tough taskmaster. And somebody that couldn't fire me, and she got me at the best rate that you can hire somebody, pro bono. So it was like a lot of work, but it's something that I couldn't say no. And so Bean versus Southwestern Waste Management Corporation was the first lawsuit in the United States that used civil rights law. And Linda McKeever Bullard developed the theory on which environmental discrimination, environmental racism legal was based, and she used civil rights law. And again, the study that I did for the case was done in 1979. And again, we did that study in support of communities that were inundated with landfills. Houston, as I said, Houston does not have zoning, and to get data like that on maps, and again, this is so long ago, we had flat maps, and using 1970 data, census data, block data were in books that you fold out the maps. In order to get the whole area of the census tracts and the block groups, you had to fold out the maps on the floor. We had map pens that we bought from a map company, and we had magic markers. Remember? We had magic markers. Red magic marker was 50% above minority. Orange was 49 to 39, something like that. And then yellow, as you go down the color scheme to yellow was less than 10% minority. So the majority of the pens were in the red, if you understand what we're talking about, 83% of all the waste. And so the idea of these overwhelming statistical evidence pointing to environmental discrimination, pointing to racial discrimination, again, having the facts is not enough. Here's the insult. The name of the landfill was Whispering Pines Sanitary Landfill. Sound like, oh, I'd love to live in Whispering Pines. People thought they were getting a new subdivision, thought they were getting a strip center, but they were getting is a landfill. And I put a lot of that in a book called Invisible Houston. The idea of these isolated cases, and there are other examples of people resisting, but there was no national movement. It was not until 1982 in Warren County, North Carolina, that a national movement was born fighting the dumping of toxic waste in a predominantly black county in North Carolina. North Carolina has 100 counties, and this company had dumped oil that was contaminated with PCB, polychlorinated biphenyls, nasty stuff, not something you want to sprinkle on your Cheerios. They dumped it along the highways. The state scooped it up in 1978. They needed a place to dump it, to dispose of it. And they went through this very rigorous process. And the envelope opened up, and the winner is Warren County, one of the poorest counties in the state and one of the blackest counties in the state. These are young people, high school students, putting their lives on the line, fighting to try to stop this waste from being dumped in their community. This is a case where over 500 residents, people from all over the country, this was before Standing Ground. It lasted 2 years, marches, demonstrations, people arrested, but the idea of this community fought back and did everything they could to resist. But the forces that be said, your community is compatible with poison. We had the evidence way back then that facility would leak. They violated EPA standards in terms of there's a shallow groundwater aquifer that this facility is over. They said it would not leak in 1,000 years. It leaked in 10. So when we talk about justice and fairness, it's not enough to have the fact. This movement, born out of Warren County, redefined what environmentalism is, what the environment is. long before the environment was considered something out there, wilderness, wildlands, wetlands. The environmental justice movement said the environment is everything. It's where we live, work, play, learn, worship, as well as the physical and natural world. And the issue of environmental justice embraces the principle that all communities are entitled to equal protection of environmental, health, housing, transportation, health. And so we're talking basic human rights. And so when we look at this whole question, in 1987, the first national study to look at this issue of waste, where waste is going, and race, was not an academic institution, was not a governmental entity. It was a faith-based civil rights organization. It was a United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice produced this study, and this study stands even to this day as one of the first and has rigor in terms of using the very sophisticated statistical techniques to isolate the impact of various variables on who gets what, when, where, and why. It was not income, it was not property values, it was not education, it was not who owned versus rented, it was race. Race was the most important variable to predict where these facilities are located. 1990, that photograph that was taken in Warren County back in 1982, I said, that's such a great photograph showing resistance, showing young people putting their lives on the line. I said, that's such a great photograph, it should be on a book. And actually, it got on Dumping in Dixie. When I wrote Dumping in Dixie, I expanded the Houston study to beyond Houston, and I used the same frame to say that the whole idea was, you ask the question, has the government been fair in enforcing environmental regulations? And are there some communities more likely to receive things that other people don't want? And going through that process using science and as a social scientist. And Dumping in Dixie, as I said, expanded. All the lead smelters in Dallas, when we looked at Dallas, for some reason, were located in black and brown communities. It was something about the hydrology and the toxicology and the epidemiology. No. It was about sociology and political science. The sociology of who gets when, what, when, where, and why, and political science in terms of power arrangements. We looked at Louisiana Cancer Alley, from Baton Rouge all the way down to New Orleans, along the Mississippi River corridor, cancer corridor, and who lives closest to the dangerous facilities. And without a doubt, communities founded right after slavery, sit down on the river, chemical companies came in later. We all went all the way to West Virginia and looked at Institute, West Virginia. A lot of people don't even know there are black people in West Virginia. Union Carbide found them in the 50s. The black community in West Virginia that we studied in Dumping in Dixie came about as a result of West Virginia breaking away from Virginia in 1865, and West Virginia was a free state. And some of those black folks were smart. They said, I'm going with freedom. I'm going to West Virginia. I don't want to stay in Virginia. And so they settled in this little area on the Kanawha River Valley, and that's where the black community, that's where West Virginia, the state, put its Jim Crow school, West Virginia Colored Institute. That's in the 1890s. The company, Union Carbide, I'm going to call names because I have tenure, came in there in the 1950s. And so when we talk about these issues of justice, the South is different. Dixie is different when it comes to the legacy of institutionalized discrimination and having laws that somehow do not apply equally across the board. But I discovered it's not just the South. And in 1991, the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice organized a national summit that said, we need to pull together people of color from all over the country because there's this whole misconception, that myth, that people of color are not concerned about the environment. And that myth was being perpetuated to a large extent by some sociologists who were doing surveys and polls. And one of the questions was asked, are you a member of the Sierra Club? Are you a member of this organization? Well, in Alabama, where I grew up, we couldn't join the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club was a segregated club, and it was white only. So to ask the question, and the answer is no, that would take out a whole bunch of black folks who fished and hunted, and they were not anglers. They were not catch and release. They were catching, clean, and cook. So we were environmentalists. We had gardens. We loved, we loved to have our land and our water and the streams and hunting and all of that. So the idea is that we develop our own summit and bring people together. First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit that we organized in '91. We developed 17 principles of environmental justice. The first principle is that people most impacted must speak for themselves. And the people who are most impacted also must be in the room when decisions are being made. That's not that much to ask. And we organized the summit and planned it for 500 people. 1,000 people showed up in 1991. And anytime in 1991 you had 1,000 people in D.C., the book says you must have a demonstration. And so we had a demonstration on the White House. State Capitol, the federal Capitol. 1994 was another important year where environmental justice had been trickling in all the way up to the state houses and people organizing and mobilizing. And Clinton, Gore won the election, and Ben Chavis and I were appointed to the transition team. And 2 years later, one of the recommendations that we made to the White House was an executive order on environmental justice. And one day we were in D.C. for a conference, and a few of us got calls on the phone to come to the desk because we didn't have cell phones. This is ancient. And we came to the desk, and I got a call that this is the White House, and we want you to come to the White House. And I hung up. I thought it was a prank call. And so they called back and said, you need to go and get this call. And it was real. And so the executive order signing, and I was in February 1994. I must say, without a doubt, that the Oval Office is a nice office. 1999 was a year when we said we want very smart people doing environmental justice and doing environmental research, dealing with race and class, and we want the National Academy of Sciences to do a study on environmental justice, and we convinced the National Institute of Environmental Health Science and the Institute of Medicine to fund this study, and they did the study, and very smart people in the National Academy. Very few people will question them. And what these very smart people found in 1991 is that people of color and low-income communities are exposed to higher levels of pollution than the rest of the nation. These groups also contract certain diseases more often than affluent white communities. We wanted smart people to say what we had been doing the research and saying all along, because having the National Academy, Institute Medicine do their studies and come up with findings to show that we were not making this up. We were doing this research and doing it out of working with communities, doing community-based participatory research, doing studies and doing all kinds of research, and finding that communities of color were impacted. And so it's important to have the National Academy do this EJ work, but it also it's important knowing that the National Academy, they do some fantastic work. When it comes to climate change, we say, scientists, you're not good at communicating. Let some of the communicators communicate. Scientists do great work. We say climate change, when it comes to climate justice, climate change is more than greenhouse gases and parts per million. It's more than carbon. It's also about justice, and climate justice demands that these issues be dealt with from various perspectives. Climate change is a human rights issue. Those communities that have contributed the least feel the pain worst, first, and longest. Climate change is happening right now. We're not just talking 25, 30, 50 years from now. We're talking about small island states going under. We're talking about what's happening up in the Arctic. We're talking about more severe weather events. We're talking about more droughts in places. We're talking about cross-border conflicts and wars. And so we're talking about famines. We're talking about a lot of issues, domestically as well as globally. And so when we talk about the vulnerability, we're talking about social vulnerability, and that climate change will exacerbate existing disparities. We're talking about preparing for these coming disasters and bringing all of the sciences and all of the disciplines to the table to talk about plans, talk about mitigation, and we talk about adaptation. And so when we talk about climate change and we talk about, let me bring this back, the impacts, and the impacts are many. Health impacts going across the board. We have the science. We have tons of data and research pointing to what is happening as well as what will be happening in terms of projections. And we also know that there's communities that's facing unequal burdens in terms of low-income communities and communities that are on front line of living in low-lying areas and living in areas where there will be greater impacts and greater damage. And this climate gap between how we're going to address these gaps when people are more vulnerable geographically and spatially. We talk about who's going to be impacted by these severe heat waves and heat islands, depending on where you live. And you can look from space and see where trees are in green space and correlate that with income and race and who is impacted right now in terms of who has money to have resilience. And again, we can map this out geographically, and there's still a lot of non-believers. The science is there. You're talking about great, consensus, but there's still this idea that where you live can impact whether or not your government or your leaders will move fast and furious to deal with some of this stuff. Here's a map that deals with climate denial. And the hashtag red, you can look at a lot of climate deniers in terms of governors. Hashtag red. Here, the most vulnerable region of the country are the areas that have the greatest number, percentage-wise, of deniers. The southern United States is prone to climate disasters at a ratio of 4 to 1. And if we talk about billion-dollar weather and climate disasters, and you overlay that in the first map I showed you of climate deniers, and here, the southern United States has had more billion-dollar disasters than all the other regions of the country combined. And the southern United States also has the largest percentage of governors that think that there's no relationship between climate and energy in terms of burning of fossil fuels. The southern United States is also the area that has the highest electric bills. Highest percent spent on per capita for power, electricity. Southern United States has let me just put it this way. Green is good, yellow is better, white is bad. That's not racial. The green represents states that have renewable energy portfolios. And look at the look where the white is. Here, states that have climate adaptation plans, the green is good, yellow is getting there, white is bad. And again, that's not racial. Here, wind energy. White, look where the white is. Green, you can see wind. Here's solar. And look, you can see that states, North Carolina and Florida and Georgia, Louisiana. But again, you can see where that white is down there. There's a lot of solar. There's a lot of sunshine in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia. A lot of sunshine. But for some reason, Oklahoma, they have not. Here's state efficiency scorecard. The darker the area, the better the rating. The worse the area, you're leaning toward light purple. Now, geographically, black colleges are located in the South for some reason we don't know, but it's probably because that's where most black folks located when these colleges were founded. Now, historically black college and university, HBCUs were not institutions for choice. I want to make that correction, and I know where I am, but these were institutions that provided education opportunity when there was none for a whole generation of population. And our schools are disproportionately located in those areas that has a high climate vulnerability. So I'm connecting it. So it makes a whole lot of sense that our schools need to be on top of dealing with climate issues. That's why we have initiated the HBCU Climate Change Initiative. There are 104 schools. We have 35 schools in this consortium that I'm part of and I'm one of the co-leaders of. We see this as training the next generation of scientists, of policy persons, of lawyers, of people to address climate, health, and dealing with equity issues. Climate justice demands that we protect the most vulnerable population. And we saw after Hurricane Katrina that the vulnerable population before the storm was the vulnerable population after. There's still over 100,000 African Americans that have not made it back to New Orleans. They are internally displaced persons. And so when we talk about climate, we talk about severe weather events, we talk about storms, we talk about, in this case, we're talking about Katrina, and God did not do it. This was a man-made event in terms of the levee breaching, and this was not a natural disaster, this was unnatural. And if you talk about the whole issue of the flooding and dealing with the fact that communities that were vulnerable, you can see in terms of government response was not adequate, and 80% of the city was drowned. The people in the convention center and the Superdome, this looks like a war-torn, ravaged third world country, people trying to escape from war. And so when we talk about the impacts, and the question is, will the government response to climate change be fair? Can we address equity in our plans for mitigation and adaptation and building resilience? And so what we say, it must have a equity lens. And so when we talk about climate change and air quality, climate change will make dirty air days more frequent. And the communities that are already living in dirty air places is going to get dirtier. The latest state of the air from the American Lung Association showed that more than 125 million Americans live in, that's 4 in 10, live in counties that got an F. This is non-attainment areas. And if you look at the geography of air pollution, dirty air is not randomly distributed. People of color are more likely to live in places that's where air quality is compromised. And America is segregated, and so is pollution. The University of Minnesota researchers showed that people of color are exposed to 46% more nitrogen oxide than whites, and 38% dirtier. We breathe 38% dirty air than whites. If you talk about where the pollution is distributed, blacks are 79% more likely than whites to live in industrial pollution, where industrial pollution poses the greatest risk. This is true in 19 states, and 12 of those states are in the South. It's true for Hispanics for 12 states and Asians for 7 states. If you talk about the geography, why we as climate justice, environmental justice advocates, why we are for a clean power plan and why we are for a clean energy plan and moving to renewables and getting away from fossil fuels and getting away from dirty coal, makes a whole lot of difference in that 56% of whites live 30 miles of a power plant. That number is 78% for African Americans. We're moving away from dirty coal, and dirty coal plants are closing not because of regulations, job killers. They're moving away because of natural gas and the cheap natural gas, and price of renewables are coming down. So the market forces are closing a lot of those plants, unlike what's being said in the public domain. Fighting for clean air in the shadow of refineries This is not trick photography. This is Houston, Texas. Communities that are fence lined with refineries, our schools, our playgrounds. This is Louisiana, Norco, Louisiana, a community that's sandwiched between 2 oil refineries. This community is the Old Diamond community. This is a community that bought land from the plantation. In 1865, when slaves were freed, they bought land from the master and set up this community. And Shell, this is in 1865. Shell came in there in the 1950s. They're sandwiched between. This Norco black community is the, I wasn't going to say the meat, but it's the tofu or the bean sprouts or whatever. It's the meat between the bread. And again, our communities, kids playing on parks, playgrounds across from refineries. This is Corpus Christi, Texas. Houston, Port Arthur, Texas. The last stop, one of the last stops of the Keystone XL pipeline is Port Arthur, Texas. In this community that's 95% African American, the community is saying, no, we already have a refinery that's refining regular, but we don't want that stuff from Keystone. This is in Houston also on the Ship Channel, a community that's so close. These are houses that are located so close to refineries. And again, this is another shot of Port Arthur. This is a public housing project. The name of the project is Carver Terrace, as in George Washington Peanut Carver. We know who lives there. This is Cesar Chavez High School that's located across from the refinery in Houston that would be the last stop, one of the last stops in Texas for Keystone XL. Climate change will impact the most vulnerable population, and we know who they are. We know what the impacts are, and rising asthma rates. And children of color, even right now, suffer asthma 3 to 4 times in terms of hospitalization than whites. Mapping vulnerability, we can map where the vulnerability are, we can map where the low-lying areas are, we can map where the climate impacts are, but I'm going to give you these belts of vulnerability. Black belt, Latino belt, poverty belt, uninsured belt, Bible belt, obesity belt, food desert belt, diabetes belt, stroke belt, pollution belt, and disaster belt. This is the United States. I'm in the Midwest now, but when I go back to home tomorrow, I'll be in the South. We have 4, Northeast, Midwest, South, and West. Zip code is still the best predictor of health and well-being in this country. You tell me your zip code, I can tell you how healthy you are. All zip codes are not created equal. The darker the zip code toward red, the more stressed the area. As you go toward blue, the better. If you look at that map, you can see a heavy concentration of the red. I was told that's not red on the map, that's salmon. I was corrected. I told whoever corrected me, I said, you know, I have a PhD in sociology, not Crayola. For me, that's red. If you look at that map in the 1860s, the slave map, the slave states, the blue states is free states, the red states is slave, and the hash marks, that's territories. That's an 1860 map of the Black Belt slave state. This is a 1950 map of the Jim Crow states. The blue states up there, that's the none, you don't have Jim Crow laws. Red, yellow. Here's the 2010 census, the heavy green concentration of black people. This is the same 1860 map that goes into the future in terms of where African Americans live. Of course, there are some African Americans up in Maine and Vermont, 3. And then you look, this is the Hispanic Belt. Look at the Southwest and South Florida. This is a map of the United States with the heavy, 2010, with the heavy blue concentration of people of color. We're in that belt along that southern tier of the United States. This is the poverty belt. Look at that heavy blue along the southern tier states, heavy blue, darker the blue. This is a map of states that receive the largest share of money from the federal government. That is, the red, heavy red states, red colored, are takers. The green are givers. Most of the red states that get more back from the government than they give. A lot of southern states are very poor, and they get more back from the feds than they give. So all this talk about we want small government, we want the federal, they'll go under. And I got stronger words, but I'm in a church. The 10 healthiest states, look at the yellow, Maine, Vermont, Connecticut, and New Jersey, Massachusetts, Utah. Those are the 10 healthiest. The bottom 20, that heavy blue, that tier, unhealthy. Mississippi and Louisiana fight each year as to who's going to be on the bottom. The worst state health departments, darker the blue, the worse the health department. Zika virus hotspots, this is the CDC map. Bigger the dot, redder the dot. The same area that's prone to being attacked in terms of Zika virus are also the areas that have the health departments that's not on the top, high poverty. Here's another map of where the mosquitoes zones are for the mosquitoes that will be in terms of outbreaks. The states that's the worst state to be a kid, look at that heavy yellow along the bottom. Worst state to be a kid in terms of school lunch, free lunch. Worst state, heavy green, uninsured, high percentage of uninsured, heavy green. This is I wasn't calling this a stupid belt, but I won't. This is the states that sued the federal government that said we don't want to be part of that Obamacare. And they sued, went to the Supreme Court and lost. And here's the states that said we're not going to expand Obamacare, expand Medicaid. We want our poor people to what? Die. Here's what a map of uninsured in 2014 before Obamacare. Look at the red, what states are, and look what Obamacare did. It turned some states. Let me go back. Red is bad. Yellow is good, and green. So here's a map of people who don't have enough money for food. This is called food insecurity by congressional district, that heavy area pink. No grocery store and no car. And people have to shop in areas where unhealthy food. 1994, when we had the executive order signed by Clinton, in 2017, when the executive order signed to strip EPA and to strip regulations. The impact of these two signings are like night and day. And the idea of why we marched, this past Saturday, we resist, we build, we rise, and the fact that there are 200,000 people marching, a lot of young people for science, marching for justice, marching for climate justice, and marching to trade. We're not going to let any agency turn the clock back when it comes to environmental protection, when it comes to health protection, when it comes to issues of civil rights, human rights, of justice. And we want to make sure that our young people understand at our historically black college and university, at other universities, understand that these are issues of the day. Every social movement that has been successful in this country has had a strong youth and student component. And dealing with climate change and dealing with environment justice is no different. Young people must own these issues, because when we talk about projections of what will happen going into the future in 2050, it won't be the America as it looks today. 2042, the United States will be majority people of color. And so when we talk about planning for the future, we don't need to wait until 2042. We need to be working on these issues together right now. When we talk about building resilience in the communities in the era of climate change, we must talk about sustainability. We must talk about just sustainability. There's a book that I wrote in 2003, MIT Press, after we came back from the World Summit on Sustainable Development. We must deal with equitable development, families below poverty, the widening health and income and wealth gap, and we must address equity issues that as a prerequisite for dealing with addressing climate change and justice. I am hopeful that we will move forward. I'm an optimist. I've been doing this a long time, and the idea that even though I was forced into duty, I know how to run a race. This is not a sprint. I'm a marathon runner. And the idea, I'm a Vietnam-era Marine. Hoorah. And the idea that there's a race that needs to be run that doesn't even exist today. It's called a marathon relay. You run the 26 miles, you pass the baton off to the next generation to run that 26 miles. I am confident that we will run this marathon and that we will cross the finish line victoriously. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bullard. I think everybody here knows now why you were invited to be the culminating speaker for this series. It really brings together so many of the issues that we've had on the table now and forces us to think about these issues, and gives us motivation to keep addressing them, as you have shown us to do. Now, I'd like to ask whether there are any questions. So let's... Pardon? Oh. Your time on the marathon. That's your first question.
40 years. 40 years.
All right. So we could take a minute if you'd like to sort of think about your questions. We have a few minutes here for Q&A. Let's go ahead, and if you have questions, we have a couple people roaming with microphones, and they can hand you the microphone if you'd like to voice a question. But wait, we'd like to get it on recording, actually, if that's okay.
Hello. So my question is, and hopefully you'll be able to answer this. Luckily, we're at a Christian institution who believes that God is also in science, but we have a lot of Christians who are skeptical of science. So with issues like this, like, how are you able to kind of like convince people who are still a little like skeptical of scientists when obviously it's more than that, like you stated, with like sociology and geography and things like that?
Well, I think the idea of convincing people of some empirical evidence that's you see with your eyes and you see what's happening in different parts of the world, and understanding that a lot of the arguments that are being made in terms of whether or not climate change is real or not, the arguments that are being made are not made in terms of science, but are made in terms of people's opinion. People can have one great sociologist who was a famous senator from New York, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He said, everybody's entitled to their own set of opinions, but not their own set of facts. And the idea that for a long time, for decades, there were people who were in government and even the scientific community were not convinced that environmental racism existed or environmental discrimination was something that existed. And when I sent the manuscript out to Westview Press in Boulder, Colorado, and anybody who knows Boulder is different. I sent it out to a dozen publishers, and I got some nasty notes back saying, well, the environment is neutral. The environment doesn't impact one population greater than the other. And I sent it out to a lot of, famous, nice, well-respected publishers, but Westview Press published the book. And more data, more research was done, and so very few people, there's still some people who don't believe that environmental discrimination is real, but again, it's almost like debating gravity. A lot of it is false debates.
Other questions?
Thank you so much for your talk, and I appreciated your humor. I appreciated hearing the stories. I appreciated hearing just the story of your wife. This has been really inspiring. It's probably somewhat of a follow-up question, because I do think that a lot of people are despairing. They're losing hope, you said at the outset you're going to explain all the facts, but what's going to take it that's going to turn. My question for you is, sometimes I confess I feel like I'm going to spontaneously combust because the evidence is so clear, the injustice is right there, and people are still doing actions that are harming people. So I guess I want to know what you do in those situations, and if there's been any success stories where you've had somebody, you've really been able to sort of turn their view.
Yeah, I think the best analogy that I can give is, for decades, we had research showing cigarette smoking caused cancer. And there was a group of scientists that were over there, sponsored by the American Tobacco Institute, that would buttress this whole argument that there's no connection and da-da-da-da-da. It took decades of continuing to move the envelope in terms of scientists continue to do their work, their research, and policy people continuing to press in terms of the governmental interdiction in terms of signage on packaging, etc. And it took mobilization, mass mobilization among communities across the country in terms of organizations, NGOs. So it was a three-pronged approach to get to that point, and finally a victory in the courts. And so even though the science was done way back, showing that cigarettes, first they said this, there's a correlation, then they put causation. We know that was causation long term. So I think the same kind of persistence and staying firm and laser focused from various sectors. And one particular sector won't get it. As I said, having the science and having the facts, it's never been enough. And you need all those other players to come to the table. But I am optimistic. As I said, I'm an optimist because I see more and more young people. I see more and more groups coming together, converging. I see that more and more people are waking up who thought we had solved a lot of these environmental issues in terms of the law years ago, and now there are attacks on these very laws that were won by some of the big environmental groups. Now the big environmental groups see themselves and their work under attack, and so they're now running to us because we have people on the ground. We have the mass mobilization on the ground to say now we join forces with the American Medical Association, American Lung Association, with all the doctors and all the scientists coming together to talk about what we need to do to address these issues that have gone unchecked, as opposed to rolling back and having a quick trip to the emergency room for so many people.
Other questions? Anybody?
Is there a reason that a professor, that both of you can answer this, I suppose, that one of you is representing blue and the other is representing red? And basically, I'm wondering if we need to change the language about which we talk about issues, like blue states versus red states and so on. But basically, or maybe have a different group of people wearing red, and those would be the ones that have read everything and are fighting for justice.
Well, when I do these maps, and I look at, I have a lot of other maps that will show the impact of, for example, I had a map that showed the impact, I didn't want to get political, the impact of the Trump Care proposal by congressional district and who would be hurt worse. It's the congressional districts that are red that voted. That's not the intent, but oftentimes there are unintended consequences of doing certain policies. And so when you start looking at where people are, as I said, if we move to small government and cut the federal budget at that level and not provide resources from the federal to the states, the poorest states in the country will be hit the hardest, and the poorest states are oftentimes politically red. So, but the pain is just as hard. For a low-income family that doesn't have enough food in West Virginia, where health issues are, they feel the pain just like somebody in California that's blue. So a lot of it is artificial when we talk about these political whatever, but lines. But what we're saying is that justice and fairness and equity should not have any political moniker. And what we say is that when we work with communities on the reservations or communities in West Virginia who are fighting mountaintop removal and contamination of their water and dealing with a lot of health problems in terms of contaminated water and air quality, these are whites in Appalachia who are now understanding that a lot of their health concerns stem back from the occupations that they have. And when we talk about a just transition from fossil to clean energy, it doesn't mean those jobs that we talked about being promised, those jobs will never come back to those mines. And we're talking about a just transition to move to renewable energy. West Virginia is a great state to talk about moving to renewable energy. And we're talking about the number of people employed. I saw an article, the number of people employed in the coal, 66,000. There are more people employed by Arby's. I don't know if you saw that. So those 60,000 are important, but we're talking about a political thing that's being waived and given some idea that environmental regulations have killed those jobs when that is not fact. And it's not even an alternative fact, it's just bunk.
Thanks so much for a terrific talk. I really enjoyed your joke about reluctance to put beef in the sandwich and then to put tofu or sprouts in there instead. You've already said you don't want to get political, so maybe you don't want to go here. You have enough inconvenient truth for one day, but I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about how that reluctance to put beef between the sandwich plays into the issues you talked about today.
Yeah. Our carbon footprint and what we eat does impact the planet. And as we move, away from, beef and start to deal with sustainability and deal with just sustainability, and I wrote a book, that's an MIT Press book, 2003. Just sustainability is put justice in the sustainability argument, and talk about economics, environment, and equity, and raising that equity part. And the idea of people who have the most need to give up the most. Poor people don't eat a lot of steak and beef and have diets that oftentimes have been very streamlined. And so when we talk about changing diets and changing eating habits and moving more to plant-based, et cetera, that has to resonate not just with food, but also with our transportation systems in terms of providing more transport for clean, efficient, more sustainable, green public transport. And so when we talk about, so when I was jokingly saying that, but you got what I meant. Yeah. We're not forcing people to be vegans and vegetarians, but we're saying, yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bullard, for your talk once again. There was a question asked earlier that had to do with how do we talk with the church when it comes to climate change. And I want to mention that study that you had in your talk with the United Church of Christ helping to put out this study that was incredibly influential in the environmental justice movement. And I'm wondering today, if you see as much collaboration or any collaboration or opportunities to work with the church, how we as a Christian community can be a strong force in this movement.
I give kudos to the UCC, United Church of Christ, because United Church of Christ was there first in the 80s, and it helped plan and fund the People of Color Summit in 91 as well as in 2002. But the idea that on climate change, there's a strong faith-based movement around issues of climate justice and stewardship, and how congregations and can work with community-based organizations and national groups, et cetera, around the justice question, and around this issue in terms of responsibility and what it means to be good stewards and what it means to be just in terms of our society. And it deals with a lot of those social parts where we talk about the vulnerability part and addressing poverty, addressing hunger, addressing the forms of discrimination that economic as well as racial and geographic that really will place certain populations and communities on the front line of those things that will, so that they'll get hit first. And so it means trying to work with some of our city and county officials, state officials, as well as federal officials. And churches, we work with lots of denominations, and from the Catholics to the Methodists to you name it, we work with a lot of them. And we welcome those collaborations and those partnerships because you have ready-made audiences and infrastructure and organizations to move on these issues, and that's very important.
One more question?
With India and New Zealand recently giving like human rights to a couple rivers, do you think that that's a step in the positive direction in terms of addressing environmental injustice? And what's your take on that?
Well, you know, there are some countries that will be moving fast and furious in dealing with making that connection with human rights and environment, Mother Nature, and climate, and earth rights. In other words, there are some people who think that the earth has rights, and that when we violate those rights, we are violating Mother Nature, the natural law. The fact that when we talk about balance, when we talk about ecology and the balance, you know, humans are part of the ecology ecosystem, but we are not the most important part, and as a matter of fact, we're just tiny speck, but we are the most destructive. So when it comes to reining in some of our human, I guess, compulsions and looking at the dynamics of human interaction and human settlements, I think it's important that we assign certain non-human entities rights. And to some extent, we have this when we talk to the issue of preserving natural areas and no drilling, or keeping them as they were, as Mother Nature, you know, had them in the first beginning. That's indirectly, I see as saying, you know, that's that particular area, a spatial environment has rights, and that no human law should somehow supersede to go in there and impact it. But that's a little far-fetched. We will never get anything like that here.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you again, Dr. Bullard.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.